Happy New Year to all of you. Welcome to our first meeting of the year, and in line with the great policy exchange tradition of striding boldly where no man has gone before, we're proud to be the first think tank to deal with this crucial topic and to give a platform to some people who've not yet had a chance to contribute their enormous and sometimes very direct expertise of the issues that we're addressing today. The four panelists will speak first, and then of course we'll open the floor to questions, and I'm sure that there will be many of them. It's my great privilege for the first time to welcome onto a policy exchange platform Henry Robinson, former Republican activist who's organised his own share of peaceful protests, observed his own share of not so peaceful protests, done his time, and after doing his time in prison in Northern Ireland, emerged as one of the most important human rights campaigners of the latter part of the Troubles in the province, notably as the key figure in Families Against Intimidation and Terror, which did so much to stop punishment beatings on young people and other victims of Republican aggression. Henry, it's a great privilege to welcome you here today. I know you'll contribute much. I know we've had some chats beforehand, and I know that the audience will appreciate what you have to say. Thank you.
Dean, first of all, thanks to you and Policy Exchange for the invitation to speak today. One of the reasons why I wanted to speak today was because obviously I come from a background as a teenager. I made some very fundamentally bad mistakes and choices by joining the extremist organisation in Northern Ireland, and as Dean alluded to, went on to form in some way to recompense a human rights group that focused on loyalist and Republican terrorist groups who were intimidating, murdering ordinary working class Catholics and Protestants. Now obviously with the peace process, we thought we were over most of that in Northern Ireland, but there is an emergence of extreme groups, some of them political in nature, and some of them not political in nature. And I was saying to Dean that some of the tactics that I've seen recently here in London, I've seen recently also, regrettably, in Northern Ireland, and it reminds me quite a lot of the past. And when I see extremism developing, like I do see it developing in London through some of these protests, I think that really it does require a response to try to stop it in its infancy. I wanted to talk about a couple of the groups that I've noticed and the way that they're behaving, particularly a group in Ireland called Ergi. They're a militant sort of, pass themselves off as a democratic organisation. But some of the things they've been up to, quite similar to the flash mobbing that we've been getting in stores here in London, and some of the extreme violence that we've seen as well. Ergi, particularly in May of this year, had a protest outside of a bank in Dublin, where they physically then went in and occupied the bank, were ejected, came back outside and burnt an effigy of bankers and trampled it into the ground. You can get it on YouTube if you really want to look at it. And in their speech outside the bank, they actually called on bankers to be hung, a direct threat towards bankers. Not surprisingly, 7 months later, the real IRA followed that up with a direct threat, putting bankers and banks on their direct target list. So I think this is a very worrying development, particularly when I look at groups in the UK, such like UK Uncut, who are engaged in flash mobbing of Topshop and other stores like that. Let me make it quite clear, I haven't organised protests. I'm not opposed to people democratically being opposed to things and demonstrating, but I think that tactics of these groups go too far. I think they, by mob-handedly getting into these shops, they're actually intimidating the workforce, they're intimidating the members of the public who are there, and I think it's unnecessary. And I worry also about what the real motives and agenda is here by drawing other young people into these protests who may genuinely and are genuinely opposed to the cuts. I worry about where this is actually going to lead. And I think if you have a look at their website, this UK Uncut group, particularly the reason why I'm sort of saying about this group is that they openly advocate law breaking on their website. They refer to their opponents as targets, and we know how dangerous that is in the current climate. And I think that it is not a democratic way to go about protesting against perceived cuts. So, and also, when I see also the trade union movement actually organising conferences last weekend, where a group like this is invited along, I wonder about what the trade union's responsibility is to the workers in those shops. I've seen quite a lot of this in Northern Ireland, where we fought against workers being intimidated and threatened. And it is very, very sad to see the same thing being replicated here. And I really do believe that there needs to be a response to this. I myself am involved with community groups opposing cuts. And I believe the way we've gone about it is a democratic and legal way, unlike UK on cut. I believe also that if there's going to be responses, I believe that the owners of these shops need to take action to protect their workers. Also, I would call into question the role of Twitter. Apparently, this particular group used Twitter. They've got some 10,000 members and followers, where they show up at a tube station, and then they outmaneuver the police to actually go to various shops, go in, intimidate the staff, and then attempt to close down the business. I think there is a lawful way to go about protesting, and I don't believe this is the way to go about it. And I believe it is a significant threat to democracy. And overall, what I'd like to say is that I don't believe that this small group of extreme hard left groups really are concerned about some of the issues. I think their overall objective is actually to cause upheaval and civil disobedience and violence to actually reach a democratically elected government. I believe that's what they're about, and I believe they should be opposed, and strategies should be developed to actually head them off at the pass. That's really it, Dean, that's all I can say.
Thank you. My great pleasure and privilege now to call upon Paul Mercer, one of the preeminent authorities on extremism of all kinds in the United Kingdom, author of the Longman's Directorate of Political Organisations, author of a fascinating work on CMD, which he infiltrated many years ago, Peace of the Dead, now advises many leading companies on the issues around protests. Paul's rare public appearance by you. It's a great privilege and pleasure to have you here. We hope you can first of many.
What I have attempted to do over the past, sadly, 29 years is combine an academic study of extra-parliamentary groups with actually going and seeing what happens on protests. And it's only yesterday I hobbled in to have lunch with some friends, and somebody said, "Oh, have you been on another riot?" And because I was looking a bit battered. And it dawned on me that 6 days of skiing in the Alps had actually caused more injuries than 29 years of attending riots. And that's what I try to convey to companies that I advise at the moment, that there's a tendency to overreact at the thought of a riot, whereas in fact in most cases they don't actually affect companies. And having covered and having been on pretty well every major public order disturbance in London over that period, what I've come to see is there's a number of factors which have to be present in order for there to be a major public order disturbance. And a couple of years ago, the Metropolitan Police said, well, as a result of, or 3 years ago, as a result of the financial crisis, they predicted, and I think it was the summer of 2007, that it was going to be a summer of rage, as the middle classes would rebel and they were going to gear up for riots. But of course that didn't happen, because the most fundamental thing for a riot to happen is there's got to be a big issue, there's got to be a lot of anger. And with the cuts, with the financial crisis, most people haven't actually felt their real effect. And it was only the tuition fee issue that actually brought a lot of people onto the streets, and of course caught the police unaware. The second thing is organisation. If you look at all of the major riots, NUM, poll tax, BNP, Reclaim the Streets, Criminal Justice, J18, May Day, then the Tamils, Palestinians, and now students, there's a lot of organisation behind it. Not necessarily organising for a riot, but organising for a protest. And the organisations behind it, if you look at all the different student groups, it's almost every occasion it's different Trotskyist groups, often rivals with each other. The same with the poll tax riots. That was the militant tendency in the form of the All Britain Anti-Poll Tax campaign. And quite often their role is underestimated. And for them, confrontation, not necessarily violence, but confrontation, having a lot of people on the streets is very important for their ideology, for their philosophy. It also means they can sell their newspapers and recruit people. And then the third layer is where there is a big protest going to happen. You actually then start to attract anarchist groups, squatters, and what the Home Secretary quite referred to as this feral underclass that comes out. Now, I was at sort of ground zero for the poll tax riot. We were actually kicked off, and that was supposedly a riot about the poll tax. But the people who attacked the police at the very beginning were not, in fact, political. They were Millwall fans who realised there was going to be a clash with the police, were irritated with the police, and went there, as one of them said to us, we're here to give the police a good kicking. Likewise with the criminal justice bill protests, which happened during the middle of election campaigns, and a lot of people didn't really realise how big they were. A lot of the real hardcore troublemakers were hunt saboteurs who'd come down because they didn't like the police, and it was a chance to actually get back. So you actually get this underclass appearing. And the final, most important factor is how the police react to it. What happened in the late 1990s was that the police developed the ability to contain large numbers of people using considerably smaller numbers of police officers. It took them, it was quite a long period of learning, but eventually by using what's called kettling, which police call containment, one single line of police officers could hold back an infinitely large number of people. And the reason that the way they did that was they were fully kitted, and they hit people, and they pushed them back, and that contained them. And what the protesters are now beginning to realise is because police officers tend not to be as big as they were 10 years ago, and more critically because of what happened with that police sergeant 2 years ago, Desmond Smelly, who was Delroy Smelly, who was prosecuted for supposedly hitting a protester beyond their rules, the police's rules. There seems to be a reluctance of police officers to actually use the force required to hold people back. And police officers I've spoken to have said that the prosecution of him has actually, or the attempted conviction of Sergeant Spelly has terrified them, because the thing they fear most are not rioters, it's not terrorists, it's the professional standards department, who will say, as a result of now everybody has their camera phones, everybody's filming them, and anything they do gets filmed from several different angles, and they know that they will be prosecuted if they do something wrong. So you actually see there's a reluctance of police officers on the front line to actually hit people as hard as is necessary to keep them back. And looking at the aerial shots of the recent student-led protests, you actually saw it took 2 or 3 lines of police to hold people back, whereas 10 years ago it would take one single line. So I think there is a big problem. The student protest didn't attract many, relative to the types of numbers that would turn out 10 years ago, didn't attract that many people. So I think that could be a big problem where you get large-scale anti-cuts protests happening later this year, where you had 20, 30,000 people in London and the police were having problems. What are they going to do when there's going to be 100,000 people? Anyway, that's essentially my understanding of it, that in order to have a riot, you've got to have an issue to make people angry, you've had an organisation, and you've got to have, if it gets out of control, and then willingness or inability of the police at both on the ground and at the senior level to actually use the sorts of tactics and strategy to contain that protest.
Thank you. My great pleasure now to call upon David Maclean, who served as police minister during the lifetime of the last Conservative government between 93 and 97, was Parliamentary advisor to the Police Superintendents Association, subsequently Conservative Chief Whip, and I think many derive pleasure from the fact, David, that your recent ennoblement, which I know hasn't taken place formally yet, but congratulations to you upon that, and I know that many your expertise in this issue is uncontested across many across the party divides, and so I don't know if you want to stand up or speak from a sedentary position.
I will stagger there if you assist.
Good, good, pleasure. You want to just get these? Yeah.
Thank you, Dean, for that very kind introduction. Overkind. I'm in the fortunate position that I've retired as a politician. I'm still not back yet as a politician, so I can speak my mind, and it doesn't matter the hang. It's not important. The subject I've got to address is, will law-breaking, direct action and violence succeed? Having been a Member of Parliament for 27 years and done the things Dean has said, I have a simple answer. Yes, it can. It can succeed unless positive steps are taken to stop it. First, for it to succeed, it requires a failure of political nous or sensitivity, whereby the government does some things that are perceived to be so unfair that a critical mass of people react against it and get angry. That critical mass may be 11 million people adversely affected by the poll tax, or 5,000 self-employed middle-class lorry drivers and farmers who felt that the fuel duty was unfair and brought the country to its knees within 5 days. Second, for it to succeed, it requires a perception that the police are incapable of effectively stopping mass protests and that they do not have the full, unequivocal support of the government. It is the perception that matters, not the reality. My perception as a punter sitting on the sofa watching the news over the last 2 months is that you can riot in London and get away with it. My perception is that over November and December, thousands of people participated in violent disorder, with hundreds committing acts of riot and criminal damage, and only a handful were arrested at the scene. The impression I get when a day or two later the police publish photos of a dozen people they want to interview or arrest is that they were incapable of getting them at the time, and begging for witnesses to tell them who they were afterwards shows weakness. Now, whatever the good reason for that approach, it gives the impression of weakness and an inability to control it. Thus, I suggest that the impression I get, and I suspect agitators may get, is that they've got the police on the run at the moment, with the government being overly neutral, and if they can destroy the vital tactic of kettling, then they really will have the police on the run. So what are the positive steps to stop it? There are two, in my opinion. First, there must be a much more vigorous political approach, and second, there must be a more vigorous police approach. So let me deal with the police issue first. As a former police minister, I am second to none in my praise of those brave officers who stood there and were battered by those huge steel gates and barricades and poles. They seemed to have to stand there for hour after hour and take it. And that fuels the perception that you can attack the police with big steel barriers and poles with impunity. And then when you get bored with bashing the police with that, you spend 20 minutes on the ledge of the Treasury smashing the windows, and still nobody stops you. Therefore, there is a need for a more vigorous approach to show to every potential demonstrator or agitator in London that you cannot get away with it at the time. The more vigorous approach, in my opinion, for the police should encompass the following. First of all, agreement on a policy to minimise the violent people infiltrating any march, and a policy to grab, as soon as evidence is adequate, those who can be charged with serious disorder at the time. There needs to be a decapitation strategy for the ringleaders, the agitators, and the worst offenders. The aim must be to allow peaceful demonstrations, which we're all happy to see. But taking out and dealing hard legally with those who are bent on violence is not only just and morally right, but it shows that the bad guys cannot win. Now, this policy needs to be publicly backed by the government at the highest levels. And let's be very clear, so that some senior police officers understand it. This is not political interference in police operations, but it is perfectly legitimate for the state to remind the police to enforce all the laws we currently have. Parliament's voted through all the necessary powers to deal with this violence and this disorder, and the police don't need any more powers, they just need to use those they have. Second point is that the police must use the intelligence they have on all the anarchist groups and the ringleaders who will encourage violence and then melt away. The police have had the pleasure of reading their websites for longer than I have, thank God, and they know who they are. It is my belief that these groups are the worst people, are relatively few in number, but some of them are very nasty and very violent. It should be a priority for the Met to target and prosecute them for every crime they commit. They're like the agitators in Northern Ireland, in the Northern Ireland riots. Women and children on the front line and the gunmen behind. And let's be clear that for them the student fees issue is irrelevant, and so are the general cuts irrelevant. Their aim is to bring down the state as they understand it, and they will latch on to any vehicle to further that end. And if you read all their websites, they're very blunt about that. And the third point for the police is, the police must grab at the scene the worst and most violent offenders committing a serious crime and take them away for rapid charging and prosecution. Now, if the Met arrest at the time those on whom they have solid evidence, especially video evidence, then they need a team of officers behind the scenes rapidly charging all those arrested. Now, I know that that ain't easy, and someone you grab on a riot and it takes 1 minute to grab them can take half a day to prosecute and process and do the paperwork, and there'll be overnight detention, and there'll be lawyers and a whole hassle. But they need a team doing that, because the aim must be that by next day in Horseferry Road Magistrates Court, all those who committed serious offences on day one are in those courts, are arrested and charged with serious offences on day two. That has to be the message. Not that the police will release some photos of potential troublemakers and will be terribly, terribly grateful if anyone knows them and if they please give themselves up. That sounds like Sergeant Wilson in Dad's Army, and that is not the message. In holding the streets, the message and the perception is all. And that leads me on to what the politicians have to do and the vigorous action required there. Well, the first point is for the Attorney General. There must be no interference with the charging process in this country. But the Crown Prosecution Service practice guidance forbidding the police to charge anyone with a Section 1 riot offence and not to lay too many charges against them either is, in my opinion, an interference with the police responsibility to decide whether or not a crime has been committed. The Attorney General should make clear to the DPP that as far as public order offences are concerned, their code of practice will be withdrawn, and the police will decide when to prosecute and how many charges to lay, depending on the evidence and on the action of the perpetrators. You know, Parliament expects the police to enforce the laws. We voted them through. We didn't vote through a practice guidance what we've never seen before. So it's not interference with the police's operational duties to remind them, just enforce all the laws if you think there are breaches. There's one other point for the politicians. However, it's a very big point and it's crucial. The government or the politicians have to kettle the political debate as efficiently as the Met kettles rioters. You know, one of my new favourite websites, Black Flag, has a wonderful lament from a class warrior that he was the only one in Whitehall selling Black Flag along with some revisionist competitors selling Freedom magazine. But that the ungrateful students were not interested in the class struggle, but were selfishly concerned about university fees. Why were the masses not uniting to bring down the state, he asked. However, there are many more thoughtful pieces in the general Fight the Cats websites, which dream of another poll tax defeat for the government. But they realise they cannot win if they can only mobilise the anarchists, the Trotskyists, the students, Bob Crow, and some polytechnic lecturers. That ain't a mass movement. That is not the critical mass yet. However, one smart agitator states that they need to get the lorry drivers involved. Now they're thinking. That is more like a danger for the government and democracy than anything else. Another thoughtful writer is encouraged by the support of some Labour Party politicians, freed from the responsibility of government. That would be a dangerous route for politicians to go down. So can a genuine mass movement emerge from this as powerful as the opposition to the so-called poll tax? I think not at the moment, but it could get close if the government were to be crass and high-handed on a number of fronts simultaneously, so that the electorate felt that it was behaving unfairly and then rose up in anger against it. Unfairness is the trigger which makes British people rise up. The poll tax affected 11 million people who suddenly had to pay more, and in some cases a lot more, and it was perceived to be intrinsically unfair. That's not my view, but that was the perception. The student fees system and the austerity measures in general do not affect a fraction of those numbers. Of course, millions are worried right now, but the concerns of the students and the public sector and the Quango workers who may be sacked are a million miles different from the businessmen worried about loss of jobs and orders, and those of us who think we're paying too much income tax. There is no common cause yet. There is no cause célèbre for the left to hijack, but they are searching for one every minute of the day. However, even the capitalist and the communist can unite if they perceive that the government is behaving unfairly. You know, most people in this country cannot spell the word Gurkha, and they've no idea where they're from or their glorious history. But if you tell the British people that a guy has fought 22 years for Britain, he's won bravery medals, but he's got no right to stay in this country, then they know instinctively that it is wrong, it is unfair. You don't have to explain anymore. We know that. Joanna Lumley made the government U-turn overnight because 90% of the people thought that was wrong and unfair. Therefore, the government needs lots of little kettles for all the potential hotspots that are going to crop up in the next few years, and slowly move them to the back burner and then put the flame out. There has to be constant repeated explanation of the fees system to the parents and students. The vast majority don't understand what is proposed. Every day there needs to be ministers explaining the necessity for the austerity measures in general, and his or her department in particular. They must settle as soon as possible the job losses in the public sector, so that the worry of dismissal is removed from the vast majority who will remain and not be dismissed. And finally, the government must be more alert that any previous government, any issue which can blow up and be symbolic of government unfairness, it has to be kettled quickly before it is hijacked by the left and becomes a cause célèbre. Now that's easy to say, but it's my experience as a politician, as an ex-chief whip, that these storms just come out of nowhere and wrong-foot you overnight. And then there are what Macmillan called events, dear boy, events. Who knows, in the next 6 months the euro may collapse, and how the government handles the adverse effects for millions in this country will dominate the political landscape for the rest of this parliament, if it happens. And then either the austerity measure will be accepted as a wise precaution or regarded as utterly wrong and unfair. Alternatively, or not alternatively, it could happen as well. We know that Pakistan is the centre of world terrorism. If in the next 2 years it collapses, either through its own internal corruption, bankruptcy, or failure to deal with extremists, or because America has taken out 160 targets in Pakistan, it's promised to do so if there is another attack on American soil, then we'll have a very delicate handling problem in this country with our own indigenous population, to put it delicately. Before you rise up in anger about what I said about Pakistan, I'm largely quoting from yesterday's Sunday Times, where "I've never felt so low," said Ahmad, the former Pakistan High Commissioner to London. Everything is collapsing. Government, community structures, law and order, and extremists are taking centre stage. So therefore, in conclusion, ladies and gentlemen, whilst I do not think that the current protests have crucial or critical political mass, nor that the potential victims of the cats will get critical mass, there is no doubt that every day a government stays in power, it makes more enemies. And over time, there could be sufficient people hurting or annoyed or angry to make massive political demonstrations with the potential to destabilise government a possibility. And we have got a plethora of extreme left-wing groups, as we've heard from our previous speakers, constantly looking out for issues to hijack. So, whilst more vigorous police action supported by the government is necessary, the vital component is political sensitivity and the ability to rapidly diffuse an issue from becoming a symbol of unfairness. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, James. It's my great pleasure now to call upon our concluding speaker, Peter Clarke, very well known to many of you here, with his wonderful crampon lecture here a few years ago. obviously one of Britain's most preeminent policemen of the last 30 years, head of the Counter Terrorism Command, former head of the Royalty and Diplomatic Protection Squad, and also Borough Commander in Brixton during the last big public disturbances there. So I can think of nobody better to sort of with greater expertise to take us through the operational consequences of the events of the last few weeks than Peter. Peter, thank you.
Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Despite Dean's over-generous introduction, I would like to make the point that I'm in no way a public order tactician. So, whilst we've heard about Sergeant Wilson, from my experience of public order, I could say perhaps I'm more than Corporal Jones. I do know that they don't like it either. I learned that certainly during the miners' strike and various other incidents since then. But I think what I'd like to reflect on, if I may, is a couple of issues about the role of the police in all of this. And perhaps to point out as well that although I entirely agree with Lord McLean's point about the need for robustness, it's not actually as simple as a matter of will for a number of reasons. And the two aspects I'd like to focus on in the role of the police. One is about the role in defending the democratic process, and the other is the impact of the Human Rights Act and the implementation or the use of the European Convention of Human Rights to determine whether or not police action is appropriate in public order. Now, I think by common consent, 2011 is going to be a tough one for the constabulary. The current Met Commissioner says his force is facing the most challenging time in its history, and the defining features of the year we all suspect are going to be protests, demonstrations, and most probably riots. Now, this is nothing new for the police. They've seen it all before, but much has changed since the events we've heard referred to today, the miners' strike in the 80s, the fuel protest, the portend riots, whatever. Because there has been an assertion of individual rights, often relying on the Human Rights Act, that's become a key weapon in any street campaigner's armory. And if there are to be battlegrounds, you can be as sure as you can be that they will be in the courtroom as much as on the streets. Now, a couple of pillars that underpin British policing have been the concepts of operational independence and political impartiality. But this doesn't mean, as some people have sometimes suggested, that they don't have obligations to the state, or that the government will not have legitimate expectations of them in times of crisis. And those of us certainly who were involved in the miners' strike, policing the miners' strike or the fuel protests will remember that very well. There were legitimate expectations of government on the police service. Recently, Sir Hugh Ord, the President of the Association of Chief Police Officers, and obviously a man well used to policing divided communities, recently said it was crucial that the police are not seen as an arm of the state delivering the elected government's will rather than protecting the rights of the citizen. Now, I fully understand Hugh's concerns about this and public perception of the role of the police, but the simple truth is that the police are an arm of the state. They're paid for by the public to keep the peace and enforce the laws passed by their democratically elected government. Now, independence from party politics is obviously absolutely critical in all of this, but the police do have a clear duty to enforce the law and, when necessary, use lawful force to defend the democratic process. So Paul Stevenson was absolutely right on the morning of the 10th of December, the day after the riots here in Parliament Square, when he said on the Today programme that there had been a determined attempt to stop something that was happening within our democratic process. Our job, he said, was to protect Parliament. And I think that was a timely and absolutely necessary reminder of why, at the highest level, we have a police service. When I watched that very carefully, the events of the 9th of December, and the thin blue line that kept the mob out of Parliament, it struck me that actually the potential impact of that was not very far removed from the things which preoccupied me for so many years in my police career, which was terrorism. It made me reflect back as well to the morning in October 1984, when I was leading a contingent of Metropolitan Police officers in Derbyshire during the miners' strike, when we heard the news that the Grand Hotel in Brighton had been blown up. There are some ways in which you could say that there are parallel ambitions through organised protest and terrorism. It's not so much the intent that is different, but the country's response, the national response to those events. And crucially, there's a difference in the legal approach. Counter-terrorism laws have grown up and then through their implementation and their usage are tested against the European Convention of Human Rights. And the actions of the government or the police are judged in that light. But in public order, something different is happening. Yes, we have the Public Order Act, the main one, back in 1986. Since then, that's been amended by no less than 29 different pieces of legislation and suffered some 90 amendments. But the most important thing is not the way in which it's been amended over years, but the fact that the starting point for the police is no longer domestic law. The Human Rights Act and the European Convention of Human Rights, it has to be the starting point the police are told in their planning of public order. And there are no less than 7 articles of the European Convention that are engaged, to use the lawyerly word, in the planning of public order. And for those of you who are great aficionados of the European Convention of Human Rights, those are articles 2, 3, 5, 8, 9, 10 and 11. And the fact is that every aspect of public order policing is being subjected to post facto scrutiny by the courts. When can the police take photographs? That's been subjected to that sort of scrutiny. And the courts have suggested when they can take photographs, how long they can retain them for. I'm not quite sure how you get a clear picture of the new age of protest if you can't actually take and retain photographs of people who are attending them. But nevertheless, when the court handed down its judgment, the police welcomed the ruling. Now, call me a cynical old ex-cop, but I've been at the end of some of these judgments in the past, and of course I've always publicly welcomed them, which is another way of saying to the courts, thank you very much. The danger of this is, the serious point is that it has the potential to remove flexibility and adaptation in the planning and conduct of operational activity. Tactics, containment, we've heard a lot about kettling. That too has been considered by the courts. The House of Lords, no less, have said, yes, you can contain people if it's done in good faith, if it's proportionate, and for no longer than necessary. That's fine, that's very good sitting in the Supreme Court to be able to make those judgments. What is proportionate? Proportionate to what? Proportionate to the intelligence that you may or may not have that tells you what may or may not happen, to what actually happens on the day, to what common sense tells you think may happen. Again, it's post facto scrutiny of operational judgments which must be constraining on operational planning. On the subject of kettling, by the way, I know it's so controversial, for another time perhaps, would be a worthwhile piece of activity to look and see what happens overseas, where containment isn't used, where distancing is used, and what happens there, the level of consequent violence, damage and destruction when the mob runs uncontrolled through cities. Look at Seattle, Rotterdam, Rome, Genoa, and there may be some instructive thoughts there. But I think my main point here is that Article 11 of the European Convention of Human Rights is now, according to Her Majesty's Inspectorate of Constabulary, it has to be the starting point for planning. And that's very difficult because that article says that the starting point has to be that the police have to assume that there will be peaceful protest. And it gets very difficult indeed. And so Her Majesty's Inspectorate, and I've always, for many years I've been hugely grateful to Her Majesty's Inspectorate for their help and support, produced a useful cut out and keep guide which is publicly available. It's on the internet, and there are reports into the G20 riots, disturbances in 2009, facilitating peaceful protest. So I thought I would just, it's a simple decision tree, lots of yeses and nos, it would help. So I just quickly ran through it, and how it might have applied to the events on the 9th of December. So it starts off, public procession as opposed to public assembly. First question, is the public procession intended to publicise a cause or campaign? That's fairly clear, yes. Is the public procession commonly or customarily held, e.g. annual Remembrance Day parade? Clearly no. Right? Has advance written notice been given? Now I assume that the National Union of Students gave written notice that they're going to hold a march, so that's a clear yes. But if they didn't, they'd be guilty of an offence. The next question starts to get complicated now. Are the intentions of those organising or participating in the public procession or public assembly peaceful? organising, well, they're not going to say, excuse me, Metropolitan Police, we'd like to organise a riot. So organising, that shouldn't be too hard. Participating, what's participating? All the people who tag on the back, thousands of people who turned up, nothing to do with the organisers, out of control of the organisers. So that begins to get complicated until the guidance to the police, the next bit down on the tree, says a procession or assembly should be considered peaceful if its organisers or representatives have peaceful intentions. Right? Then Article 11 kicks in and the police have a clear duty to enable this to happen. But what about if those who you suspect are going to turn up aren't going to be peaceful? Question, do you have compelling and demonstrable information or intelligence that those organising or participating in the protest will use, advocate or incite violence? Compelling and demonstrable. What does that mean? Anyone know? I don't. But even if you do, it says, even if there is a real risk of a public procession or assembly resulting in disorder by developments outside the control of those organising or participating in it, such a public procession does not for this reason alone fall outside the scope of protection guaranteed by ECHR Article 11. So we go straight back to the fact that the police have both a positive and a negative duty. A positive duty to refrain from hindering through unreasonable indirect restrictions the right to peaceful assembly, and a duty to take reasonable measures to protect the public. In other words, what I'm saying is, this is, to my mind, hugely and deeply unhelpful. It's a recipe for confusion and for post facto scrutiny, which cuts straight across the sort of activity in the response that Lord Maclean was talking about, of robust, clear activity. And when the courts do scrutinise all public order policing in the light of the Human Rights Act, what will their approach be? Now, for most of the past decade, the government's been locked in endless litigation, it feels like, over counter terrorism legislation. And the courts have overwhelmingly come down on the side of the individual, almost irrespective of the impact on national security. Will the courts take the same approach when the inevitable challenges to police tactics are raised in the future? I don't know. No one can guess. But perhaps smashing the windows of the Supreme Court on the 9th of December might not have been such a smart move. Who knows? What do we need to do about this? The exam question, will violence succeed? I think there really does need to be a review of the domestic public order legal framework. It doesn't need more powers, as Lord Maclean has said. There's plenty of power there available. But does it need a proper review to see whether or not it is actually appropriate to the current wave of protests? It may be that it's fine, but is there something about re-establishing primacy of domestic law over interpretation of the European Convention of Human Rights? And I think the other thing, it also parallels very much what Lord Maclean said. We've got to be sure that the public discussion of organised rioting, and I can't think of many spontaneous riots, someone's organised it somewhere, it must reflect the seriousness of what it represents. At its highest, it is, as I've said, an assault on democracy, and we need to really challenge the weasel words that we hear about understanding people being angry, or what we heard so much after the attack on the Millbank building, claiming that violent rioters were being victimised. There's no victimisation if somebody who commits an offence is arrested and charged and prosecuted. That's because that's what they did. I think we need to, mentally at least, compare the ambitions of some of the current crop of protesters and with terrorists. As I say, the distinction, to my mind, is not so much about their intention as in our response to them. And I think it must be clear, surely, that establishing a sound legal framework to deal with it is surely for Parliament. It shouldn't be for the police and for the courts to try to chart a path through this in an incremental, confused way after the event. One could say that there's a danger that otherwise the horse may well have bolted, but by the time we decide whether it was proportionate or necessary to bolt the stable door, it may well be too late. Thank you.
Thank you, Peter, for that superb presentation. In the spirit, we hope that this will, I'm sure, generate a very, as Chinese diplomatic communicators would say, a full and frank exchange of views. So I hope we're going to get no question too outrageous, just the usual house rule: you have to declare who you are, name and organisation. Do I see first question? I can't believe there's nobody here. Name and organisation.
My name is Rory Robertson, I'm a solicitor. I'm very interested in what Lord Maclean was saying about day one, the riot, day two, horse magistrate storm. One of the problems, I think, is that, as I think you yourself said, there's a lot of cameras there. People are taking photographs, police officers are taking photographs, rioters are taking film, and so on and so forth. And the difficulty, I think, that a lot of the police officers who are getting quite used to the public order stuff, is that they know that there's going to be a lot of undisclosed material there. They need to look at this material. And this is a real problem, I think, in the police force, because the junior officers are fighting some of the more senior officers who want to make their names in dealing with this new phenomenon. And the junior officers, as I understand it, are saying, well, look, we don't want to do anything just yet. We're going to wait a couple of weeks. We're going to go and have a look around at all this film. And then when we've got it, we can see that we can make a prosecution that can stick. And that seems to me to be a real difficulty. I mean, I'm very sympathetic to the way you put it, but it does seem to me to create a particular problem.
Do you mind if I remain seated? I appreciate your point, and I do accept that, as I'm trying to say, that it takes 5 minutes maybe to arrest someone, throwing a steel bar at the police officers, 5 minutes to arrest someone, throwing a gate at the police officers, and then it may take 10 people in the Met and their lawyers 5 or 6 hours to combine the evidence to make that charge stick. But the answer there, I think, are the videos we've seen. I could sit on my sofa and see people committing serious crimes. And I saw the police officers in the front line react to it. They were getting battered by steel gates. And then the Met did a wonderful thing. Once the steel gate fell, or the barricade fell on the ground, the Met front rank charged forward about 3 yards, a snatch squad behind grabbed the gate, pulled it out of the way, problem solved. But why didn't that snatch squad then just go through the front rank shields and grab the 2 guys who battered them with the gate? The evidence could have been clear. The Met were no doubt watching it on monitors at Gold Command or Silver Command. There's lots of video footage of that. So there was sufficient evidence, in my opinion, for quite a large number to be charged that day and for the charges to stick. But I do accept there are a large number of others. Maybe the guys, and I must be careful here in case it's sub judice, maybe the guys on the Treasury ledge whose backs we saw, and I didn't see their faces, and I couldn't say that's him, arrest him. That may require a few days for the Met to go comb through all the other films they had, all the other tapes, and then find those guys and make the charges stick. But I come back to the point, if they don't have snatch squads and enough processing, legal processing power behind the scenes to get these people into Horseferry Road Magistrates Court next day or 2 days later, then the perception is that hardly anybody was arrested at the scene, hundreds were committing acts of violence, and the Met are begging people to come forward. That gives an impression that you can cause trouble in London and get away with it for a while. And if you're lucky, you won't get caught at all.
Gentleman there. Name and organisation, please.
Alistair Aberdare. I'm a small businessman and a hereditary member of the House of Lords. It's been an absolutely fascinating session, and one of the clear complications in this is how you draw and enforce the line between legitimate protest on the one hand and unacceptable extremist behaviour on the other. And I think there's been some very good suggestions on the second rather, what you do about the people who are clearly behind the trouble, causing the trouble. But what about the others how do you actually protect the rights of those who are there because they feel anger, because they feel unfairness, because they feel that their children should not be being cattled for 6 hours or whatever it is. And one phrase that I'm slightly surprised hasn't come up at all in the discussion so far is control orders, because it seems to me again there's a sort of similar balance between what is fair and what is unfair. And the danger is if the system that we're adopting becomes seen in the public eye as being on the unfairness side of the divide rather than the fair side. Slightly incoherent, but I hope it's...
The question is for Lord Maclean or for one of the other panellists? Did you?
Well, I really don't mind who answers it. Peter Clarke perhaps as well, in terms of dealing with the goodies on the other side as well as the bad.
Yes, thank you. Could I first of all respond to the point made by Mr. Robertson about police officers wanting to make their name by getting involved in public order? Over my fairly lengthy career, can I honestly say I can't remember anybody who was interested in making their name or getting promoted or making a career out of being involved in public order, serious crime or terrorism, because that way lies risk. Very cynical view, but the most ambitious don't tend to put themselves in the way of reputation and risk. So I don't think anyone's going to make their name or a career out of this. It is a really difficult problem with this. How do you protect the rights of peaceful protesters? And I think, as I probably very inarticulately tried to say during my presentation, that I think we've gone too far through the presumption that the Human Rights Act, now in the European Convention of Human Rights, imposes upon the planning of these events. I think there is something though about communication during these events, hugely difficult. How do you communicate with a fast-moving crowd with all the noise and confusion that inevitably arises? But I think there is something about if you can give the peaceful protesters every single opportunity to move away. They're warned that this is likely to become violent because there are people who seem to be intent upon committing acts of violence. If they're given every single opportunity, that certainly, I think, diminishes the opportunity for subsequent complaint that they're innocent and caught up in it. You will all have seen on the television the first 3 or 4 rows of protesters holding hands above their head and then backing into police lines as a deliberate ploy to try to suggest that they weren't doing anything, they were just minding their own business and standing still. I mean, complete rubbish, obviously. You could see that very clearly, that they were deliberately provoking the police into violence. And if you wanted to see it even more, look up the YouTube site at some of the films taken by anarchists and others, looking into the police lines. As a fairly seasoned ex-police officer, I found some of those pretty frightening. The levels of violence, intimidation, and provocation that were being displayed was extraordinary. And you'd obviously, I think you have to say to yourself, would any peaceful protester leave themselves in the midst of that? And the answer has to be no.
Just quickly, Henry. I think it's a huge responsibility on behalf of the organisers to get this extreme organisations out of the peaceful protest. I think there's a huge responsibility on them. They watch the websites, they know exactly who's showing up, they know particularly that a lot of these groups advocate violence. And what I'd like to see in some of these protests, the dozens of civil liberty people with cameras focusing on the police, should begin to focus on the people who are actually giving their demonstration a bad name and taking control back of their own demonstrations and telling these people that they're not welcome at their demonstrations.
Good, I've got a lot of questions, so I think we'll, gentleman over there in the far corner there, name and organisation, please. I think we'll take them as a clutch of questions, actually.
Tom Gallagher, academic, Bradford University. My remark concerns the fact that now the public culture in Britain is very oppositional, and we see that in the types of lawyers who have emerged both on the judicial bench and also practicing. The fact that so many policemen now come through an academic system where many of my colleagues don't regard the present order in Britain as legitimate, and that contestation and struggle against that order is seen as necessary for refining democracy. So, I mean, because the whole profession of politics now, unfortunately, has fallen into some disrepute, there are very few people that the media can draw upon who can emerge naturally and remind the public, who are still committed to the rule of law, you know, of the privacy of peaceful resolution of conflict. I mean, the whole political atmosphere in Britain has changed decisively, and you know, I think it is going to be very difficult for those who want to hold back the agitators to be able to seize the public ground effectively because of, you know, how institutions have changed.
Thank you. Gentleman there as well to take 2 questions, 2 along from you. Name and organisation.
David Page, private individual. My point is, we are actually exceptionally lucky recently that Parliament continues to be the focus point of demonstrations. And if that ends, which could happen if the Met decide that Parliament is not to be the focus, then we'd have a lot more difficulty. And the other one is, what about the extreme right, and in particular the EDL, BNP and the hangers-on? They are just as vocal and opposed to what is going on as are the extreme left, and probably have more resonance outside London than you imagine, amongst those who see themselves as very much the focus of the cuts, which is the white working class. And the other point, the earlier question I made, is the difficulty of getting those who wish to be violent out of the non-violent part of the protest. It's actually very difficult when you're kettling the entire process. And you have to look at YouTube, where there were scenes of people who said they did want to leave, who were pushed back into the crowd for a long time. And the other one, and I only looked at a little of the footage, is the rather bizarre, and I think it was bizarre, the use of the mounted branch into Parliament Square, which even the BBC correspondent at the time thought was a bit strange. But if you then look at YouTube and see how they were pushed out of Parliament Square, that was more worrying to me than actually their charge, is the mob were able to push them back. And the police, in my experience, have lost the nerve to do what is necessary because they are so used to post-event investigation and not doing it at the time. And if somebody gave a clear lead at the time, then police officers at the lowest rank would do what was required. You may not like what you see because it will be violent, but it will be something which is completely different to kettling, which is dispersal. And dispersal leads to problems, as a certain man in a Rolls Royce discovered.
Paul, do you want to answer any of those?
I think from my experience of seeing it, the Met introduced containment tactics after the J18 riot in 1998. And then shortly after that, there were the May Day protests. And they were organised essentially by the same people who were activists from Reclaim the Streets, who in turn had been involved in the anti-road protests. And as I said earlier, it took the Met quite a long time to work out that the only way of containing those situations was to deploy very large numbers of police officers to seal in the people who were intent on rioting. And after the first anti-globalisation protests, the Socialist Workers' Party belatedly discovered that this was quite a good issue, and they set up an organisation called Globalised Resistance. And 500 of them, I was there as they marched up Regent Street, and to the top of Regent Street, and walked straight into the Met's first attempt at containment. And they were there 7 hours later, and that was the last time they ever tried to do that sort of mass protest with the anti-globalisation activists. And at the time, in about 9 years ago, activists finally said, well, there's no way we can attempt large-scale protests in London, because the Met have really got their act together. We can't have the sort of running battles that we had in 1998. We can't do the Reclaim the Streets tactics of on one occasion, very successfully, all hopping on tube trains and then blocking a motorway in West London. And then the police thought, well, they're not actually doing anything too seriously. Too serious here, they're well out of central London, we'll just leave them to party. Little realising that they're actually drilling 2 holes in the motorway and planted trees. So when they left at 6 o'clock, there were 2 trees planted in the motorway, and the Daily Mail on Monday couldn't resist the temptation of the caption of protesters plant trees, people are looking into it. These policemen looking down the holes that they've drilled. So I think we sort of say about the dangers of containment from the human rights perspective, but having seen these running battles as protesters rampaged through Covent Garden, as they smashed up Oxford Street, as the police tried to see what was happening in Hyde Park at night, and you have police vans screaming around and the forces running all over the place. From my experience, containment or kettling, as people call it, is the least worst option. And of course, there are civil liberty implications. But my view is if somebody chooses to take part in a protest that they know is going to be violent, then it's better that their liberties are momentarily restrained than actually having innocent shoppers and potential monarchs get attacked on Oxford Street.
Any question anyone want to answer Professor Gallagher's question?
Little point, yes. Very much. Yes, I think Professor Gallagher from Brantford. There is an oppositional culture and a rights culture in this country, and everyone wants their rights. But at the moment, that's largely directed through Parliament and democracy. At the moment, I think sufficient people feel that they're getting their fair dues from the parliamentary process, that we don't have that critical mass of people who think Parliament has failed us, therefore taking to the streets is the right answer. And if I could comment briefly on David Page, I think he's absolutely right. At the moment, it's centred on Parliament in London, and thank God for that. I say reluctantly, I hate to see Winston's statue defaced, it's disgusting. But the kettling tactic must be retained at all costs. If you read Black Flag and Freedom and the Whitechapel Anarchists and all of their stuff, getting rid of kettling is their top priority. They would love to spread out all over London. And those who complain that the Met shouldn't have kettled 2,000 in Parliament Square, then complain that they let 50 escape and get to Regent Street, with the potentially disastrous consequences there. I hope there will never be any more question of getting water cannon in London. It's a nonsensical suggestion. Not that I think we're British and we shouldn't have these things, but what if you've got one thing to protect and you don't care where else the rioters go? Then yes, you could use water cannons, yes, you could charge them with horses and get them away from that one thing. But we don't want 2,000 rioters spread or sprayed all over London to commit acts of violence at any one of 50 or 100 targets. So yes, they must be retained in that kettle as humanely as the police possibly can, and let them out slowly in dribs and drabs to wander off. And finally, you're right about the BNP. It will be different issues. They are a danger, but I think their danger is to make a few 100,000, 500,000 people angry about one sort of issue. It will be a different anger from those in the hard left have managed to provoke, but it just still adds to the number of miscellaneous groups of people who feel angry at government unfairness, and then slowly over time it can stack up to that critical mass.
I think quite a lot more questions. I'm going to, there's a gentleman at the back, gentleman in the middle there, and then gentleman in the aisle. Thank you. Name and organisation,
Right.
please.
So, David Henke, freelance lobby journalist and blogger, write from everything from Tribune and The Guardian to the Sunday Telegraph, to give you an idea. My question is, and apologies for being late, is I think you're being incredibly complacent from your perspective about how people can organise now, because basically new technology is miles ahead. I mean, with this little thing, BlackBerry here, you don't need a website. All you need is a Twitter network or a Facebook network. And if I wanted to, say, organise a demonstration outside the nearest, Rue Brothers restaurant, all you do is send a text to your network, and so the people who are organising the demos don't know. The second thing is, I don't really think people realise, this is as an investigative journalist, I obviously dig in and look into people. By combining 5 publicly available websites, and including everything from 192.com to Compass's House, it is possible to find the private address of almost any citizen in the UK. I don't think people realise this. And if people start organising flash mob demonstrations, and there could be quite a problem. And I'd quite like to know, and I'm also author of a historic book on the history of the miners' strike, where actually the left were completely outflanked by the government and everything else. But this time you've got an entirely different situation. There were no mobile phones, and all we were talking about was better security at the mines, with proper lighting. So I'd love to know, sorry to be a bit long, how you see new technology is jumping miles ahead of you, actually, as far as the police are concerned.
Thank you for that very welcome contribution. I'll take them as, because as I said, there are a lot of people who want to ask questions, so we'll take them as a clutch of 3 this time. The gentleman in the blue shirt there, and then there's the gentleman in the aisle. Name and organisation, please.
Thomas Brooks, Centre Forum. I've been on many peaceful marches on the similar route to the 9th December one, which received far larger numbers of people marching, but received 0 national media coverage. And in regards to the UK Uncut, they clearly seek to encourage violence from private security, and they target flagship stores like Oxford Street, and the flash mob is also very media friendly. And with the 9th December, the media focused largely on a fire and windows being broken. I wonder whether the panel accepted that there is incentive for people with grievances to break the law because the media focuses so much on these images and stories, and if so, is there anything that the government or the police can do about that?
The gentleman in front of you also wanted to ask a question, and then I think we'll have the panel respond. Name and organisation, please.
My name's Graham Tucker. I'm a control room manager at the Bank of England. By coincidence, I spent 30 years in the police, retired some while ago, but I saw the tactics change in dealing with public order, and in fact the process of kettling, to my mind, was the ideal answer. And as you all know, the G20 demonstrations last year were held right outside my building. Now, I spent 2 days up on the front of the facade of the building watching the police tactic of kettling those demonstrators, and I saw lots of people being arrested. And this was brought up by Lord Maclean. The snatch squad idea was used. The police had spotters on our building, and they directed their officers on the ground, and a great number of arrests were made at the time. I think that point has been lost because shortly afterwards, as we know, there was an unfortunate incident resulting in death. And unfortunately, the media took that as the main event, and the police tactic, which was ideal and very practical, was lost in the media scramble to more or less bring a stop to the story about the good success by the police.
Thank you. Thank you. Henry, do you want to come in on the whole issue of changing technology, say between 84 and 85 miners strike now, that David Henke made, and then the other questions?
Yeah. I mean, simply what you're dealing with now is mobilisation at their fingertips. And that's why I mentioned earlier about Twitter. Twitter's rules and regulations forbid aggressive use of their technology, and I think that there could well be a case of somebody seriously injured in Topshop, or this gets out of control. I particularly mentioned UK Uncut because they, on their website, talk about law breaking and it being legitimate to break the laws, and they have a whole series of historic comparisons which I don't think bear any relationship to today in democracy. And I think that particularly on UK Uncut, one of the most dangerous things is that, as I said, they refer to people, their opponents, Philip Green, people like that, as targets. I think it's very dangerous language. And I think there should be some kind of mobilisation of people in those shops, ordinary people, against that kind of. But I think that Twitter are wide open if something goes wrong here. And the police obviously don't have the technology or the ability at this stage to keep up with the kind of locust move that they're able to do, Twitter to each other and move around. And I think the UK Uncut page should be pulled. I think there's enough evidence there for them to be pulled, and therefore limit their ability to actually cause intimidation of workers in these stores.
Peter, just on the question which I think one of your former colleagues asked there about whether the tactics were apparently right, but were, of course, as your colleague, your former colleague, like jiggered or sort of aborted, as it were, by the tragedy of lesbian ponderers.
I think that's entirely possible. As I said, I've never been a public order tactician, and certainly wouldn't wish to second guess through looking at a television screen tactics used at any particular time. I will just make one comment about the extraction of violent people from a crowd. I do know there's always a balance between taking out the people who are causing problems and denuding the police strength in order to contain the crowd. Because inevitably 2 or 3 police officers have to go away with the arrested person to deal with the processing. And I remember well, probably the wrong place to say this, but about 25 years ago I personally arrested 3 members of the Federation of Conservative Students at the other end of Whitehall.
We're here.
and that did cause a problem in terms of the gap in the police ranks that it immediately caused. But nevertheless, I do think Mr. Henke's point is absolutely right about being complacent about the ability of people to use technology. It's not only in public order this is the case, but there is a political judgment to be made here as well, which is about to what extent does Parliament consider it acceptable for the arms of the state, to use that expression, to have the ability to monitor, to intervene, to learn what's happening through the use of new media. That's a very political judgment. What was the other question?
Paul Mercer, Unshackled.
Unshackled. Was this the bit about liberties being momentarily restrained? There was certainly a comment made that that's better than having wholesale disorder. Well, yes, I'd agree. Is that a balance, though, which the courts, sitting 9 months or a year after the event, would agree with? Will that be the case? I don't know. Nobody knows, and that's the point I was trying to make, that using post-facto litigation as a means of developing public order tactics is not, I think, the right way forward.
Paul?
Just responding to David Henke's question, I'm not absolutely convinced that Twitter is as important as The Guardian would like us to think. At the largest UK Uncut protests, which was on, I think, Saturday the 16th of October, they claimed, and Channel 4 News reported without questioning, that they had actions in 55 different locations around Britain. And I went through those, and I could actually identify, and still have only identified, 15 actions that took place. And those have tended to occur where one would expect there to be actions, such as London, such as Brighton, Sheffield, Cambridge, Oxford, Manchester, Liverpool. And in other areas, there may have been 1 or 2 people, but I saw no evidence that this was, as UK Cut claimed, the start of the Twitter rebellion, that people had been mobilised for its first action as a consequence of Twitter. The very first UK Cut is something that evolved from the London climate camp. And their very first action, they told people to meet near Oxford Street, and nobody knew that they were going to go after Vodafone. But virtually everybody who was there because they had been contacted through the existing networks that the London Climate Camp had, or had seen it on the website. I do, however, think that websites are very important, and so far as the student cuts protests are concerned, as I said, you've got a variety of different Trotskyist groups encouraging protests. They're rivals amongst each other. But superimposed upon that, you actually have a number of backbench Labour MPs who are actively giving their encouragement to these protests. And I think that that's a far more insidious development. The fact that you have protests that we know are going to be violent, and yet you have elected members of Parliament who are not condemning them, but actually encouraging them to take place. But as I say, back to the original question, I'm slightly cynical as to whether the rioters are actually busy sending Twitters to each other saying, "Hey, let's go up to Regent Street now." I think that in the thick of a riot, people just don't have time to think about that, and it's just the mass of people. Something, having been in many of those situations, something just takes over. You instinctively know when the police move, you run away from them. You don't have to look at your iPhone to know that.
Very good. A couple more questions.
They've asked about the media.
Did you want to?
I don't really want to answer it. I'm not the best qualified to do so, but you deserve some sort of answer. I think, yes, the media go in phases. all through December, I was fed up of them trying to find the coldest place in Britain, or the person who slept longest on Heathrow Flow. I suspect if there's another snowstorm in a few weeks' time, they're not interested. They've already done that. Maybe they've done the police failed to contain the rioters, or maybe they've done the, and I choose my words carefully, police brutality pulling a guy out of his wheelchair. Well, I drove through the edge of the riot in my wheelchair. Police don't know me from Adam, and they kindly parted the ways, moved a van, and let me through. If I got into the middle of that, I wouldn't whine if they pulled me out of my wheelchair, because I had no right to be there in the middle of that riot. However, there's no one speaking for the good guys in this. The police are constrained in what they can say, sub judice, due process, all that sort of thing, and I don't think the government are doing enough to put the other side. All the anarchist groups and the others, they're quite sexy in a way. And I don't want to be unfair I agree entirely with David Henke, but I don't want to be unfair on the media generally and say they're lazy. But if you spoon feed them a press release, they'll use it. They'll use 90% of it. And there's lots of groups feeding them stuff about the victimisation by the police, the brutality and the justice of their cause. And that's from the RMT union, some Labour, misguided, backbench Labour MPs, unimportant in a way, never been in government, never will be, but nevertheless they give something some legitimacy which it doesn't deserve. All of these people are feeding stuff to the media, but there is no concerted effort or coordinated effort on the other side to shoot that down. And so far politicians have stayed too neutral in this. Oh, it's a police operational matter, mustn't get involved. No, it ain't. The law is being broken. It's legitimate to comment. It is not legitimate to say, Peter Clarke, arrest that fellow there. Utterly wrong. But it's legitimate to say, Peter Clarke and others, you better start arresting those who are breaking the law. And if there's obstacles to you doing it, then we'll look at the Human Rights Act and we will try to make the necessary changes. But we've got to win the media battle by having a better story to tell than the bad guys.
2 more questions, because lady there.
A very media question, the royal wedding.
Name and organisation.
Sorry, Michelle Neibert from NBC News. A question to all of you. What impact do you think the royal wedding will have on these extremist groups? Are they going to use this as an attempt to derail or not?
And one more question, do I see anyone else? Gentleman there.
David Myers from the Community Security Trust. I was going to initially ask a question about the far right, but that's been brought up already. My question is linked to what Lord Maclean said about immediate arrests and immediate charging. 2 years ago, with the Gaza demonstrations, we saw long-term police investigations, 90 people arrested, over 60 charged, and then some serious jail time handed out to some of those protesters. But because it was a year, 18 months after the demonstrations, we saw very little media coverage except for some of the supporter groups from the far left. So the coverage was not much there. If they had those immediate charges, it would put off other people demonstrating in the future and have that immediate effect.
Anyone want to answer? Peter, on the former head of the Royal Diplomatic Protection Squad, right?
On the subject of the royal wedding, I hope very much that these groups don't seek to take advantage of it, because I know full well the type of operation that the Metropolitan Police will be looking to put together will be one which will be designed, obviously, to provide security. That's obvious and it goes without saying. But it will also be designed critically to enable all those thousands of people who want to come to enjoy the day. It's the happiness business, and that will be very high up in the objectives for the operation on the day. So let's hope that these people don't try to destroy a day which the rest of the country no doubt will be looking to enjoy. The immediate arrests and charging bit, yes, I know it's very attractive, it's a nice idea. Let's get them on the sheet, let's get them in front, as they use that expression, let's get them in front of the judge, let's get them weighed off very quickly, but it simply doesn't work like that. And quite rightly, there's a requirement to prove criminal charges beyond reasonable doubt. The Crown Prosecution Service have to fulfil their criteria before charges can be brought. Now, I take on board David Maclean's point about perhaps we can go back to what used to happen, which is the police can prefer charges of their own knowledge and of their own bat at the beginning of the process. But we have laws of disclosure, everything has to be disclosed, the defence have to have time to evaluate all that material. and so on and so forth. It is a fact that particularly when offences are serious in nature, it is a very, very long process. And even if you did charge somebody straight away, the prospect of a Crown Court trial could be anything up to a year away, or in the sort of cases I've been dealing with the last few years with terrorism, some of them have taken 4 years to get to the point of trial. So it is a slow process. There's no swift or easy solution to dealing with serious offences within our criminal justice system.
Did any of our other panellists want to come back on any of that?
Yeah, there are already suggestions that the royal wedding should be disrupted, and Class War and Ian Bone and people like that will be talking to the media and predicting that thousands of people will be turning out to show how they support Britain becoming a republic and getting rid of the royal family. But they always do this, and the reality is there'll be a relatively small group of people will turn out, and compared with the many hundreds of thousands of people who will be in London, I suspect on the day itself they won't be noticed. The only danger that I see is that an anti-royal wedding protest is actually combined with an anti-cuts protest, which could actually mobilise quite a lot of people. But so far as just a class war opposing the royal wedding, well, I think they'll be lucky to get 50 people.
Well, thank you all. I think you wish to join with me in expressing our appreciation for the